I never feared the Germans. I feared the gasoline. They say George Patton was the general who could make tanks fly. That isn't quite accurate. He was the general who made tanks fly until they were screaming for fuel, and then he made them fly on fumes. I'm sitting now, in 1947, in an office in Frankfurt that smells of stale cigars and defeated empire. I am folding up my charts, preparing to leave the service. They were charts nobody wanted to look at during the war. Lines and curves of human breaking points. My official title was Lieutenant Colonel Alistair Vance, Combat Sustainment and Troop Psychology Analyst, a temporary patch on the uniform of the 3rd Army Command. My job was to see the reality that Lieutenant General Patton refused to acknowledge. He was a hurricane, a military phenomenon that defied physics. Chaos, I learned, is manageable. You can study chaos, measure its entropy, and harness it as a weapon. The true horror of war begins when order itself starts moving at such a terrifying velocity that it becomes its own form of chaos. From August 44 onward, we lived in a world where maps were redrawn every hour. Doctrine? Tossed into the mud. Logistics? A constant, desperate prayer. Our version of Blitzkrieg was not the cold, engineered precision of the Wehrmacht. It was a furious, almost religious run. We weren't advancing. We were tearing the earth open like a predator. And every day, as the sun climbed over the dew-soaked French fields, I felt our success pulling at the thin, invisible thread connecting us to supply lines. If that thread snapped, we wouldn't just stop. We would become the largest, fattest, most vulnerable target on the continent, an entire army frozen solid. Patton didn't just command men, he commanded speed. And speed, Alistair, tolerates no dissent. It devours doubt like high-octane fuel. And it devours the men who cannot keep up. I was meant to be his inner voice of caution, his cold mathematical break. Instead, I became his shadow, a dedicated accountant furiously tabulating the true cost of his genius. The price was always appalling. The 3rd Army's tactical headquarters, TAC HQ, was not a location. It was a state of being. It was the eye of a storm, perpetually moving, always coated in a fine layer of dust and permeated by the odors of diesel, stale coffee, and unwashed fear. We moved so fast that we barely had time to pitch the tents, often setting up command in the back of a radio truck, on a folding table in the middle of a sugar beet field, or in some dilapidated French barn smelling of straw and ammonia. I sat over my reports, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the systemic exhaustion that afflicted the entire staff. I analyzed casualty reports and, more critically, reports on losses due to non-medical causes. Disorientation, non-responsive anxiety, inability to follow orders, what was officially termed combat stress reaction, and unofficially, broken nerves. These curves were my barometer. And those curves climbed relentlessly, mirroring the line of the front on our situation maps. Colonel Taggart, the operations chief, a man hardened by North Africa and Sicily, would sometimes glance at my projections and snort. "Vance," he'd rasp, rubbing the stubble on his chin. "If you think numbers can stop the old man, you're wrong. He doesn't give a damn about statistics. He wants a map with no red." Patton's appearances were sudden, like a force of nature manifesting. He didn't enter, he erupted. Even in a dusty field uniform, he carried the aura of a parade ground. His boots were always impeccably shined, his jaw close-shaved, even if the nearest wash basin was miles away, and those goddamn pistols with the ivory grips seemed bolted to his hips. They were theater. But his entire life was theater, and it was a form of performance art that was winning the war. He could stand for hours before the massive situation map tacked to a barn wall, outlining advances with his riding crop. His gaze was sharp, detached. He saw not fields, villages, or people. He saw only vectors, arrows, and the potential for greater velocity. "We will not allow them to breathe, gentlemen." His voice was dry, loud, and metallic. "We will not allow them to fight the war they want. We will fight the war I want. We will press until they turn into mush." He demanded his driver sleep 4 hours, and his forward scouts sleep while they were moving. He allowed himself no weakness, and by extension, he allowed his men none. This was his greatest strength, and this would prove to be his most fatal vulnerability. It was the evening of August 15, 1944. We were positioned just north of Chartres, poised for a deep breakthrough toward the Moselle. The TCHQ staff was tense. Captain Langdon, Patton's aide, found me hunched over my stress reports, his face glistening with sweat under the kerosene light. He's got something from Washington, Colonel. Something bad. Keep your head down." I nodded. I knew this wasn't a tactical failure. For those, Patton had fire and brimstone. For political problems, he had a cold, white explosive rage. Patton's tent was lit by a single lamp, and he stood with his back to me, his shadow stretching across the canvas ceiling, turning him into a terrifying giant. He held a cablegram, folded so tightly I could see the paper it cracked. "Vance!" He spun around. His face was pale, but his eyes were burning embers. "You're the brain specialist, correct? You study why a soldier suddenly turns into a wet rag?" "Sir, I study trauma and stress reactions," I replied cautiously. "Trauma?" He spat the word out. "It is cowardice, Vance. Medically sanitized so we don't have to hang them." He slammed the cablegram onto the table. It was notification. The press was about to publish details regarding 2 separate incidents from Sicily a year prior. General Patton had visited 2 field hospitals, and upon encountering soldiers diagnosed with war neurosis, he had publicly, physically humiliated them, slapped them, and ordered them out of the hospital as fakers. The incident was notorious in the inner circles, spoken of in hushed, shame-filled tones. "This filth, Vance," Patton pointed to the paper. "This is sabotage. This is an attempt to take my army away from me at the moment we are ready to rip the throat out of the Germans. They claim I lack control over my emotions." He clenched his fists. "I control everything, damn it. I control every jeep, every shell, every tank in this goddamn army. I command it better than anyone. But this is a political knife in the back." He didn't regret the slaps. He regretted that the scandal would slow his advance. His moral compass, when it came to human weakness, was utterly, irreparably broken. For him, a soldier in the hospital with shell shock was a traitor, not a casualty. "I am to fly to London, give testimony, humble myself before a collection of desk jockeys?" he growled. "No. We will push so far ahead that the scandal cannot catch us. Vance, your new mission is this. Ensure no report of combat stress reaches above regimental level. Ensure every broken man is sent back to the front unless they have a measurable hole in their head. And most importantly," he leaned in, his eyes 2 burning coals in the shadows, "we do not stop until we take Metz. We will bury this slap under tons of German corpses and miles of captured territory. Make certain my commanders know, speed is now a political necessity. It is our alibi." I left the tent feeling the cold dread replace the adrenaline. My mission had fundamentally shifted. I was now tasked not only with analyzing exhaustion, but with suppressing the evidence of it. The slapping incident was not merely a moral failing. It was the inciting incident for a reckless, politically motivated breakout. Speed was no longer just a strategy. It was the general shield. The next 2 weeks were a logistical nightmare that Patton seemed constitutionally incapable of noticing. He lived in the paradigm of perpetual motion, while those of us in TAC HQ were fighting over every drop of fuel. By August 20th, as we neared the Marne, our tanks no longer smelled purely of exhaust. They smelled of desperation. We were moving faster than the Supreme Allied Command could route resources through the immense, war-shattered French infrastructure from Normandy. The turnaround time for supplies from the Normandy beachhead to our forward units now theoretically required 7 days. We were covering that distance in 3. I sat in the communications truck, comparing the daily fuel requirement reports against the projected delivery forecasts. The figures were stark, brutally clear. Third Army operational need, tanks, and transport 800,000 gallons per 24 hours. Actual delivered supply, Red Ball Express and Air dropped 350,000 gallons. Remaining reserves, critically low, less than 2 days of full operational capacity. I tried to present these numbers to Colonel Taggart while he reviewed the situation maps under the glare of a hooded light. "Colonel, we are at a critical minimum. If the weather breaks tomorrow and we lose air support for emergency drops, we stop. The Germans could counterattack, and we won't have the fuel even to maneuver defensively." Taggart leaned back in his field chair, rubbing his eyes with bone-deep weariness. He was one of those who respected Patton, but held no illusions about him. "Vance, you don't get it. The general doesn't think in gallons. He thinks in objectives. He believes that if we move fast enough, the German defense won't have time to consolidate, and we'll capture their depots. He thinks we'll reach their gasoline before ours runs out." "That isn't strategy, sir," I argued, stabbing a finger at the reports. "That's a high-stakes gamble where the entire army is the chip." Taggart gave a tired, cynical smile. "It's Patton, Vance. If he played by the rules of logistics, he'd be Bradley. We need his madness precisely because he refuses to acknowledge mathematics. We need his reckless impulse to compensate for our material disadvantage." It was then I realized the central, horrifying truth. Patton was deliberately leveraging risk as a weapon. His speed was a strategy of exhaustion, not just against the enemy, but against himself and his superiors. He was forcing a supply crisis to coerce Supreme Command, Eisenhower, into allocating him more resources, under the implicit threat that the Third Army would grind to a catastrophic halt deep inside enemy territory. This wasn't military doctrine. It was strategic blackmail. He wasn't aiming for a standard victory. He was aiming for a breakout so overwhelming that no one could stop him or condemn him afterward. His goal was not simply the Rhine. It was glory at any cost. As we approached the Moselle River, the German resistance stiffened noticeably. The enemy was finally reforming after the rout in the Falaise pocket. The giddy rush of the breakout stalled. The extent of the troops' exhaustion became visible not just in my numbers, but on their faces. I was dispatched with a mission to the 6th Armored Division, which had just forced a crossing over a minor Moselle tributary. My official cover was assessing communication efficiency. My unofficial goal, to understand the true breaking point of the men being pushed past the limit. The forward outpost was a hell of mud, shattered steel, and agonizing screams. The recent rains had turned the fields into a slick, viscous soup. Gasoline hadn't reached this far, but German high-explosive shells certainly had. I located the field aid station, set up in the ruins of a stone farmhouse. The stench was overwhelming: blood, disinfectant, wet earth, and the sharp, coppery smell of burnt cordite. I saw dozens of soldiers requiring immediate surgery. But there were others sitting, clutching their heads, intact physically but utterly hollowed out. I approached a tank gunner, Sergeant O'Connor, slumped on an ammo crate. He looked 40, though he was probably 25. He had lost his crew 2 hours earlier. He just stared into the void. "Sergeant," I said, keeping my voice low. "Colonel Vance, HQ staff. How are you holding up?" He didn't immediately register my presence. When he finally raised his eyes, there was no hatred or fear in them. Only exhaustion and dull indifference. Me? I feel speed, sir. Speed? Yes. General Patton, he's like a train. He don't see nothing but the tracks ahead. He doesn't care who's standing on them. We were supposed to cross this river in 2 days, but the Krauts, they were ready. And when we stopped, they just started firing. He took a ragged, deep breath. You know what the worst part is, Colonel? Not the shelling. It's knowing he won't stop, even if we all drop. He'll just send another company forward. He'll just say, keep going. We ain't soldiers to him. We're parts of his engine. We break, he replaces us. I scribbled in my notebook, morale, low. Root cause, continuous breach of tactical exhaustion limit. Heroic sacrifice perceived not as honor, but as inevitable mechanical failure. I returned to TAC HQ with a leaden heart. I had to write the report. If I wrote the truth, I would hand Patton another political club to beat him with. I would confirm that his aggression was shattering American soldiers as effectively as German artillery. If I lied, I betrayed those sitting in the mud. I chose bureaucratic compromise. I noted a high degree of tactical attrition, but attributed it to unexpectedly fortified positions. I was now part of the cover-up, a functionary in the general's personal theater. The pressure on Patton was mounting from the rear just as quickly as his tanks had moved forward. The supply crisis was not confined to the Third Army alone. Montgomery, in the north, was demanding fuel for his ambitious Operation Market Garden, and Eisenhower had to make a painful decision regarding resource prioritization. I was present when Patton received the encrypted message confirming the decision. Ike was temporarily diverting the bulk of the fuel convoys north to support Monty's attempt to seize the Rhine bridges. Patton's explosion was apocalyptic. It wasn't mere anger, it was an existential fury. That cowardly politician. Patton threw his riding crop at the map, puncturing France. He is handing my victory to the British. He doesn't understand inertia. My army is the icebreaker. We're smashing the hole. And he forces me to stop so that tedious little man Montgomery can play his strategic parlor games. He got on the secure line. I only heard his side of the conversation, but it was deafeningly clear. If you take my fuel, General, you must accept responsibility for the Third Army stalling in the middle of enemy territory. Do you want the Germans to crush us? Do you want all these sacrifices to be for nothing? Give me the fuel, and I will be at the Rhine. I will do it in 30 days. His arguments were magnificent. From the standpoint of pure military momentum, he was correct. His breakout was the only real chance to end the war before Christmas. But Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, had to consider not just Patton, but the integrity of the entire front, the political coalition, and the catastrophic failure that would occur if an army was entirely cut off. In that moment, I understood. Patton was a military anarchist. He used his genius to destroy the system he operated within. He could not work inside a coalition. He could only dominate or be restrained. And when restrained, he viewed it as a mortal betrayal. He fought not only Rommel, but also the Pentagon, London, and Eisenhower himself. His greatest enemy was not German armor, but the bureaucracy that demanded equitable resource distribution. He was being shut down because he was too effective, too demanding, and too fast for the slow, grinding reality of coalition warfare. He was a force that couldn't be commanded, only pointed and eventually contained. Late that evening, I sat alone in my communications truck, trying to ward off the penetrating autumn dampness. I stared at my psychological sustainment charts. The rate of mental attrition had reached 85% by my metrics. Ideally, the Army needed a minimum of a week's full halt for rotation and restoration. Patton had granted them 24 hours to lick their wounds before the final, brutal assault on the Metz fortifications. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. I needed to write my personal, internal report. Not for the general, not for Washington. For history. From Lieutenant Colonel A. Vance. To the record. Subject, General Patton. He was necessary. The War of 1944 could not have been won by cautious, rational men. It required a figure who believed in his own myth so deeply that the myth became reality for his soldiers. He forced them to believe in invincibility because he believed it himself, even when surrounded. His speed, in the long run, saved thousands of lives by denying the Germans the ability to establish a static line of defense. But his genius demands a human cost that he is fundamentally incapable of recognizing. He does not see the individual soldier. He sees a number in the manpower resource column. His refusal to accept the concept of combat fatigue is not merely callousness. It is a profound strategic flaw. If you refuse to acknowledge the emotional and mental limits of your troops, you cannot predict when they will break. And when they break, they will not break one by one. They will break simultaneously, and that will stop his icebreaker permanently. When he collapses, he will take us all with him. I burned the note in my coffee cup, watching the flames consume the bitter truth. Accepting this reality was my own private defeat. I was here to quantify the human factor, yet I had become a factor controlled by a single, dominating will. The will of George S. Patton. September arrived, bringing heavy rains, and with them Metz. Metz was an old, heavy, cursed city, ringed by formidable Imperial German forts. This was not the war Patton was built for. He was the master of maneuver. Metz demanded a siege, a slow, bloody, grinding attritional battle. The rain grounded air cover and throttled supply lines, turning the French roads into viscous, churning rivers of mud. The Sherman tanks, designed for speed, bogged down past their treads. Patton could not accept this stasis. His fury peaked. He ordered me to accompany him to the forward units to witness how real soldiers overcome adversity. He was seeking validation, a witness to his own unwavering greatness. I knew he was looking for a stage worthy of his enduring myth. We drove to an observation post situated on a height a mile from Fort Dryant. Visibility was terrible. Through the smoke and drizzle, I could see the silhouettes of our tanks, immobile targets in the distance. They were simply stuck, pinned to the earth. Patton ignored the shriek of incoming German shells. He stood bolt upright, disregarding the protests of his escort. "This is what war is, Vance. Not maps and not damn numbers. It is will. The sheer desire to force the enemy to yield." He drew one of his pearl-handled revolvers, though the Germans were far out of range. He looked like an animated statue, posing for an oil painting. He started speaking louder, addressing the handful of muddy, utterly exhausted officers huddled around us. "I know you are having a rough time. I know you are tired. But you will not stop. You are the Third Army. I will tolerate no whimpering. I will tolerate no faint-heartedness. When your grandchildren ask what you did during the Great World War, you will not say, 'I was sitting in a hospital with a headache.' You will say, 'I stood on the Moselle, and George Patton dragged me through the gates of hell.'" It was a magnificent, theatrical, inspiring speech. But it was completely detached from reality. He spoke of abstract heroism while his men were freezing in the mud, waiting for enough fuel to change position. He was appealing to will when all they lacked was a single gallon of gas to keep moving. He was a genius of movement warfare, but in static siege, in the mud and the slow grinding attrition, he devolved into an unbearable, self-absorbed tyrant. He could not comprehend that sometimes, to win, you have to stop. We were returning to the HQ, navigating the treacherous, muddy tracks, when an incident occurred that remains the quintessential image of Patton's strategic failure in my mind. We stopped near a forward communications relay point, crucial for directing counter-battery fire. The senior lieutenant in charge of the radio, a young man named Carter, was sitting on the ground, his head resting heavily on his knees. The radio was silent. The communications major jumped out and started shouting. "Carter! God damn it, we've lost contact with the 8th Battalion. Pick up the handset." Carter didn't move. Patton, hearing the commotion, halted his jeep and strode over. "What in the hell is going on here?" "Lieutenant!" Carter slowly raised his head. His eyes were wide open, but utterly unfocused. He wasn't wounded, not drunk. He was empty. He stared past Patton, past the shining helmet and the iconic pistols, seeing nothing. This was a man who had reached the absolute end of endurance. The physical and mental engine had simply seized. "Do you hear me, soldier?" Patton's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. He began to move toward Carter. I could see the muscles in his jaw clenching. I saw the familiar wind-up, the gesture that had cost him nearly everything in Sicily. He was going to strike him. I reacted instinctively, without considering the consequences. I stepped squarely in front of Patton, blocking his view of the lieutenant. "Sir! Request permission to report. Lieutenant Carter is displaying extreme combat stress reaction. We cannot—" "Get out of my way, Vance!" Patton tried to step around me. "I will show him what stress is. Sir, he is non-responsive to external stimuli. This is not cowardice, it is total nervous exhaustion. If you strike him, he will not snap out of it. He will shatter. And that, General, will give Washington the leverage to stop you permanently." I used his own weapon, the threat of political catastrophe. Patton froze. He looked at me, and for the first time, his eyes held not pure rage, but cold, analytical calculation. He weighed the options: humiliate this lieutenant and create another scandal that could stall his advance, or restrain himself and preserve his speed. He restrained himself. He took a ragged, deep breath, his nostrils flaring. "Get him out of here. Immediately. Send him back. Replace him with someone who can hold the goddamn handset. And if I see another example of this weakness, Vance, I will relieve you of duty for failing to ensure the psychological resilience of my army." We drove away. I saved Lieutenant Carter from a slap, but I hadn't saved his nerves. I had saved Patton from another public disgrace. I realized I wasn't just his accountant. I was his cleaner, sweeping up the human fallout of his genius. And I knew, this man, who despised weakness above all, would never forgive me for witnessing his moment of near-total collapse. Metz finally fell in December, after the bloody, grueling battles that Patton never wanted to fight. He continued his blitzkrieg, stopping the Germans in the Ardennes counteroffensive and eventually punching deep into Germany. His genius was vindicated by victory. I survived the war, but my career in the 3rd Army Staff ended as soon as we crossed the Rhine. Patton didn't fire me. I was too useful, but he couldn't stand me. He simply assigned me to the bureaucratic planning of the occupation, safely away from the front lines and the press. In 1945, after the victory, I watched Patton trip over his own hubris yet again. His sharp, arrogant remarks about denazification, his comparison of Nazis to American political parties, his open contempt for the political process, it was too much. The war was over, and the genius needed to fight it had become a political liability. I was in Washington in December 1945, working on demobilization reports, when the news broke. Patton had been in a car accident. It was too absurd to be real. The general who survived machine gun fire, dozens of air raids, and tank duels was killed when his staff Cadillac collided with a 2.5-ton truck on a slow, routine road outside Mannheim. He was going pheasant hunting. He didn't die instantly. He was paralyzed. He passed away 12 days later from a pulmonary embolism. I read the investigation transcripts. Officially, a tragic accident. Unofficially, in the halls of the Pentagon, rumors swirled. that his death was convenient, that Patton was too large, too uncontrolled a figure for the new, politically charged world order. I didn't believe in a conspiracy. Patton could not be killed by an enemy. That would have been too heroic. He died of boredom. He died of banality. War was his only true medium, and once it ended, his own aggression, his insane internal speed, lacking an external target, turned inward. He died not in battle, but in a hospital bed. The irony was perfect. The man who refused to acknowledge human weakness was ultimately felled by the weak, fragile human body. Now, years later, sitting here in the quiet aftermath of the war, I can finally formulate my final verdict. Not for the archives, but for those who look upon his bronze statues and his polished photographs. George S. Patton Jr. was the embodiment of the paradox. His military genius was absolute. He was the only general who could compel the American mechanized fist to move with such velocity that it cracked the spine of the Wehrmacht. He was a man who believed in reincarnation, who was convinced he was born for war, and that belief, that terrifying self-conviction, made him unbeatable on the field. But his flaws were as monumental as his talents. He was a tyrant because he could not separate the concept of leadership from absolute, personal dictatorship. He viewed the army not as a command structure, but as an extension of his own will. His lack of empathy, his contempt for the diagnosis of shell shock, and his profound political naivete were not mere eccentricities. They were fundamental flaws that almost cost him his career and nearly crippled his army. The victory of the Third Army was purchased with two currencies, gallons of gasoline and the complete expenditure of his soldiers' nervous energy. He was the genius of speed, and he used that speed to silence the voices of his own command, his superiors, and his own conscience. My personal role, as I see it now, was to be the man who kept the engine running by lubricating it with lies and strategic cover-ups. I hid the true human cost of his genius so that he could achieve the greater victory. If I had exposed his tyranny under the Moselle, Eisenhower would have been forced to relieve him. And without Patton, the war might have stretched into 1946. He was the poison needed to cure the disease. But once the cure was complete, the poison began to consume its host. I look at his portrait now, the severe, clean-shaven face, the rigid posture, the dramatic pistols. I see a magnificent anachronism. A man who was too Roman for the modern world, too obsessed with cavalry charges and absolute martial glory for the age of industrial warfare and coalition politics. Patton could control the chaos of the battlefield, but he could never control the chaos of his own character or the universal, human need for rest, doubt, and compassion. He was defined by his speed. He could never slow down. And in the end, that inherent, unstoppable momentum denied a battlefield, destroyed him in a simple roadside accident. He was a general for war. And that is why he could not survive the peace.